All right, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Lopez, and I am the manager of film and lecture programs at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Thank you for being part of our first public virtual lecture, Fresco from Classical Painting to Modern North Carolina. This lecture is in conjunction with Christopher Holt's exhibition at the North Carolina Museum of Art called Contemporary Frescoes, Faith and Community. This exhibition features monumental drawings, intimate portraits, and studies by artist Christopher Holt. The fresco is the result of a 2-year community project led by Holt with the Reverend Brian Combs, founder of the Haywood Street congregation in Asheville. We hope that once the museum reopens, you can all come and experience this wonderful exhibit. We understand that this type of virtual programming is new to many, including us, and we would like to take the opportunity to thank you all for joining us on this journey and supporting the NCMA in its new endeavors. Before I introduce today's lecturers, I'd like to give everyone an overview of our program for today. The virtual lecture should last about an hour and a half. We're going to devote the last 10 to 15 minutes to questions from the audience. Please enter any questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. When asking questions, please specify if the question is for all or one of the speakers. We will try our best to get through as many questions as we can. I would also like to disclose that this lecture will be recorded and made available on the NCMA YouTube account. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's lecture. Christopher Holt was born in Asheville, North Carolina, and his roots have a strong hold on his native land. His work reflects a connection to nature as well as a deep humanism. An artist from childhood and a Chapel Hill studio art graduate, his artistic muse has carried him throughout the globe, leading him back home to pursue and share his artistic vision. Christopher spent 10 years working as a student, instructor, administrator, and apprentice with legendary fresco painter Ben Long, a relationship that immersed Christopher in a classical study of drawing and painting and gave him great experience in the art of fresco. This endeavor enabled him to work with many incredible artists and allowed him to hone his artistic skill. His work demonstrates a firm grasp in the fundamentals of drawing and painting, exhibiting a graceful line and a free use of color. Christopher finds inspiration working in the TAPAS, Teaching Artists Present in Asheville Schools program. He has had the privilege to work with many young students and finds that the experience provided for the youth of our community is powerful and transformative for everyone involved. He continues work on a project in the Dominican Republic, bringing Haitian and Dominican children together to create murals in their community. In 2019, his first large-scale fresco project in Asheville, the 9.5 foot by 27 foot Haywood Street Beatitudes, tells the story of a community that places the importance on relationship above all else. It works to break down the barriers between the haves and the have-nots, reminding each person of their inherent worth and dignity. The fresco weaves imagery both realistically and metaphorically to describe what the community is about, affirming sacred worth, restoring human dignity, and sabotaging the shame of poverty. The Haywood Street fresco announces, in plaster and pigment, that you matter. Thank you, Chris, for being a part of this lecture today. Would you like to say hello to the audience?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining in. I'm really looking forward to this first lecture, and gonna just let things get started.
Now I'd like to introduce Perry Hurt. Perry is the paintings conservator at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Perry received a BFA in painting and printmaking with a minor in art history from Virginia Commonwealth University in 1983. He continued conservation studies at VCU from 1985 to 1987. After college, Perry formed the Fine Art and Mural Conservation Studio in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which he owned and operated from 1987 until 1998, and included fresco conservation projects in the US Capitol building. In 1998, Perry became the NCMA Conservator for Regional Conservation Services, an NCMA Foundation position which offered art conservation to institutions throughout the state. In 2008, Perry's museum position changed to Conservator, an NCMA state position, with his responsibility switching to the care of the museum's permanent collection, including research and conservation, treatment of paintings, routine maintenance, and remedial treatment of the collection, and conservation oversight of all NCMA collection loans. Perry also contributes presentations, tours, and blogs for the museum. Since 2001, Perry has conducted research on the history of artist paint. This work has resulted in extensive museum programming, including the Focus exhibition, Revolution in Paint, which Perry curated in 2006. In 2010, Perry started an in-depth study and conservation treatment project for the NCMA's early British portraits. The paintings and research were showcased in the 2016 exhibition, History and Mystery, Discoveries in the NCMA British Collection, which also marked the first time in 40 years that the NCMA had organized an exhibition focused on British art from its collection. Thank you, Perry. Would you like to greet the audience as well?
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. And I hope everybody's doing well. And I think with that, let's just jump right into the presentation. Can I have the next slide? The exhibition at the North Carolina Museum of Art comes with a twist to it. And the twist is that it's all about a very large mural that can't come to the museum. It's an integral part of the Haywood Street Church now. So the exhibition it includes many drawings, large and small, and all of those works can stand as an individual work, individual artwork. But we have to keep in mind that, in fact, they are all tools. They're all studies that were meant to support the creation of the larger mural. Visiting the exhibition, seeing these drawings and the other materials there, we get a back door to the artistic process, the mind of Christopher Holt. But we also get a very close approximation of the complexities of bringing a community together to create a very large artwork. And this has been true throughout the history of fresco painting as long as it's existed. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about how to make a fresco, but also the history of fresco. And I hope this will help you when you do visit the museum in the future. Of course, we hope to be reopening very soon, and we would love to have you there to visit the exhibition. Next slide, please. True fresco is a very specific medium, and it's been around for a very long time, thousands of years, in fact. And many, many landmark artworks have been contributed in the medium of fresco, and more recently in North Carolina itself. Fresco is rarely practiced today, and it is subsequently not very well understood. Next slide, please. There are many things that are not fresco. Human beings have been making art for a very, very long time, and we've been talking about that art for a very long time. But our vocabulary, the words that we used, have shifted over time. So sometimes we're not all talking about the same thing when we mention an art term. A fresco for many people is simply a painting on a wall. And you see examples of that here, but none of these are fresco. At far left, we see urban murals. This one in particular is from Philadelphia. The one next to it, of course, is from Raleigh. These are not fresco. The image in the middle is an ancient Egyptian tomb. Many of us see images like this. We even have some in our own museum, but these are not true fresco. The next image is of Angela Lombardi, one of the employees at the North Carolina Museum of Art and a very experienced mural painter. She knows how to make a fresco, but she rarely chooses to do that. And then the last image on the right is, of course, the famous Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci. And he again chose not to do fresco. Next slide. So why was it that Leonardo did not choose fresco? He had a wall, he had a place to put a monumental painting. Fresco was very well practiced at the time. He knew all about it. He was very capable of it. He had the paint, he had the materials, he had the skill. He was a fantastic drafts person. He could draw very well. He could plan very well. None of those were a problem. The problem with fresco is it is very constrictive. It makes great demands on the process. You have to plan it intricately in advance, spend a lot of time in creating your composition, but when it comes time to paint it, you have to paint it very quickly. And the medium itself does not allow for mistakes or the correction of mistakes. It's quite difficult. Leonardo didn't want to be constricted by this process, so he created his own medium. A mixture of various different things. And as a result, the painting is actually a disaster. Artistically speaking, it's a fantastic painting, but as far as properties of the painting itself, it started to fall apart very quickly and was in very poor condition even within his lifetime. It's been restored a number of times. If you look at the image to the left, it looks somewhat like a complete painting at first glance, but if you look more closely, all those dark little islands that you see, that is the actual original paint. All the soft colors are all restoration. So at least from this image alone, you can kind of deduce that probably 80% of the painting is missing. All the rest restoration. Next slide. So what is fresco painting? Here's the mechanics of it. If we look to the lower left of this slide, you'll see just some simple diagrams of what a fresco painting is. It always starts on some kind of a wall. It might be stone, it might be brick, it can even be wood or metal lathe. On top of that, several layers of plaster are applied and then the paint applied on top of that. The lower part of that diagram, you see a very simple symbolism for it, the brick or stone wall, the oricio, which is the first layer of plaster, the second layer of plaster, or generally the last layer of plaster that is applied is the intonico, and then the paint is applied on top of that. In this diagram, it shows a very clear border between the paint layer and the intonico layer, but in fact, the paint itself sinks into the plaster layer, which is part of the key to the robust, long-lived nature of a fresco. The key ingredient of a fresco is calcium carbonate. So if we look at the upper left here, we see a chunk of chalk. Calcium carbonate comes naturally as a mineral in many different shapes, chalk, limestone, and several others. And that's where we start with. We pulverize that to make a lime plaster. We pulverize that and we heat it. That produces calcium oxide, which is also called quicklime. To quicklime, we add copious amounts of water. We absolutely drench it in water. And slowly but surely, the process, in the process, it becomes calcium hydroxide, what we call slaked lime. Now, this process is very slow. In modern times, generally it's slaked for about 6 months. In Rome, in ancient Roman times, that slaking process was legally supposed to be at least 3 years long. And in Michelangelo's time, it might go on as much as 10 years. And in all those cases, it just increases the quality of the slaked lime. Once you have your slaked lime, the first thing that you do is apply the oricio layer. And the oricio layer of plaster has a lot of sand, and it has some other things in it that help the structural integrity of it, such as horsehair. This is applied relatively thick wall, and it covers up all the blemishes, it evens it out, and makes a relatively flat surface, although still somewhat rough because of the sand. Once that layer has dried, and just to be clear, it has been put on the whole wall. The whole wall is done at this point with plaster. The artist starts to apply the drawing for the composition. Now, at this point, the artist has spent a very long time doing multiple studies and creating the composition that he wants on a small scale, a relatively small drawing. And at this point, the job is to blow that up to fill up the wall where it's going to be. And generally speaking, artists use a graph system, a grid of lines to help in blowing up that drawing onto the wall. Traditionally, this drawing is done with a red pigmented crayon of type, and that's referred to as synopia. The color itself is referred to synopia, and the drawing itself is referred to as synopia. Next slide, please. The next step is in the process is for the artist to go back and make a drawing of his drawing, essentially a tracing of the full-scale drawing. In the case of the photograph that we see at the left here, we have Diego Rivera working on top of his full-scale drawing, not the actual wall in this case. But in many cases, this tracing can be done of the synopia drawing. The drawing is made onto the tracing paper, and then the major lines in that tracing paper drawing, there are small holes are poked in it following those lines. Sometimes a tool like we see here with a wheel on it is used just to make the process a little faster. The next step is the application of the final plaster layer called the intonico. Now, the intonico is only applied to an area that the artist intends to paint that day. This is the trick. The painting must be done in wet plaster. That area, the giornata, it's called a giornata, is applied with the wet plaster that day, and it butts up against previous work. In the image here, you can see at the upper left, excuse me, the image is upper right, but in that image at the upper left, you can see the green of this particular fresco that's being made, and the fresh plaster is put right up to that and then smoothed out. The artist then puts his tracing paper over top of the wet plaster, aligning it with the previous day's work to make sure that his new work in this fresh plaster will be lined up correctly. Then the drawing, the tracing paper, is pounced. That is, a small cloth bag filled with powdered pigment is bounced along the lines of the drawing, and the loose pigment goes through the holes onto the wet plaster, transferring the drawing. Now we're ready to paint. Next slide. Applying the paint can only be done by someone who is extremely familiar with painting. This is a very difficult process in many ways. First of all, the pigment, the paint that we're using, so to speak, is only pigment and water. There's no binder in it. If you applied this to, say, a plate, a hard surface, within a few hours, the water would evaporate and the pigment you can just simply brush away. There's nothing to have it. The trick is that the wet plaster itself is the medium. The pigment and water go onto the wall and it's soaked into the plaster and becomes a permanent part of it. But this has to be done while the plaster is wet. In most cases, the artist has about 10 hours to do this process. It all depends on the conditions. The artist can do various things like spritz water on the wall, things like that to slow down the process, but inevitably it will dry out and the painting in that area must be finished in that time. But the environment makes a big difference. If you were trying to paint this in the middle of a desert, you might only have 4 hours to paint before the plaster dried. If you were doing it in a swamp, maybe 20 hours, who knows? But the point is, it has to be done while the plaster is wet. The next big problem is that, generally speaking, the artist is doing this fresh, new, wet area right next to a dry area that he did on a previous day, he or she, excuse me. That dry area is much lighter in tone because it is dry. The wet area is therefore going to be much darker in tone. So trying to match the color between what was done previously and what you're doing now is quite difficult. Generally speaking, on a big project like this, there's someone who is put in charge of just overseeing the color that's used from day to day to make sure that it is consistent. And I think Chris will speak about that later. Many of the pigments that are used in general painting do not work in fresco because the environment of the plaster itself is highly alkaline and it will damage a lot of the pigments that are used, say, in oil painting or acrylic painting, that sort of thing. For instance, no dye pigments can be used in fresco because they are highly pH dependent. They will be decolorized, they'll change color, they'll fade away, that sort of thing. So most generally speaking, the pigments that work the best are earth pigments or mineral pigments. The color is applied very thinly, very much like a watercolor, which leads to our next problem. The next problem is that it's extremely hard to fix any kind of a mistake. You can't cover it up. You have to live with it. If you don't like a mistake, you have to let the wall dry out completely, chisel out the mistake, replaster that area. After the fresco dries, some painters apply additional paint using a different medium, maybe to cover up mistakes or to use a different pigment that they couldn't use straight away in the fresco. This second painting is called a secco painting, and to be truthful, purists generally consider this to be cheating. Next slide. So let's talk about the history of fresco. The earliest frescoes that we know come from the Minoan civilization. It was from about 3000 BCE to circa 1450 BCE, and they are fantastic paintings. I believe most of these images come from the palace at Knossos on the island of Crete. You can see they're fantastic paintings. Some of them look very modern to me, highly colorful, all those sorts of things. But one of the things I want to point out is that these paintings have been heavily restored, but they still exist. And I think that says a lot about the robust nature of fresco, because The Minoan civilization was destroyed by natural disasters, earthquakes in particular. And of course, their buildings crumbled and that sort of thing. But the frescoes survived, and we can still appreciate them today. Next slide. Now we'll jump to the Romans. The Romans were fantastic painters. They had access to all the pigments from the large empire that they covered. They had extraordinary colors to call on, and you can see a lot of those in these paintings. Just extraordinary paintings. The one at the lower left is one of my favorite. That gradation from top to bottom of the orange to the yellow is just fantastic. They also love to do things like trompe-l'oeil painting, making that flat wall surface look three-dimensional. And they would often incorporate architectural elements that had these three-dimensional shading and whatnot. It's really fun to see these works. Having said that, we need to keep in mind that fresco in its nature is generally part of a building. It's part of an architectural statement. And it frequently plays off of the architecture itself. And in many cases, you really aren't experiencing a fresco image like we're seeing on the screen here without seeing it in the context of where it was made. It adds so much more to it. Next slide, please. So here's for instance, this is a Roman bedroom that's in a museum at the Metropolitan. And just to be clear, the floor is original, the walls are original, and the ceiling I do not believe is original at all. But still, it gives you the context of how a frescoed room might look for a Roman. By this point in time, fresco was quite common. Certainly the rulers and the aristocrats had plenty of fresco in their civic buildings and in their private residences, but even middle-class people had frescoes at this time. It was quite common, and the Romans were very good at it. They give us a nice insight into the process of creating fresco with this stone relief stele that we see at the upper right. And just below it, you see a drawing of what that represents. And here we see the process of creating a fresco. At the lower right of that image, we see a gentleman working with the plaster, preparing for it to go on the wall. Just above on the scaffold, you see another person applying the plaster. And then to the left, in the center area there, you see an artist applying paint. At the lower part of the slide, lower left, we see 3 bowls of pigments. These are actual pigments that survived the destruction of Pompeii. And once again, not to put too much emphasis on it, but we have the frescoes of Pompeii because they are so robust. Almost everything, material culture of the Romans was destroyed by the eruption of Vesuvius. We only have the architecture and in a few cases, a very few artifacts and these wonderful paintings. Hmm. Next slide, please. If we just say the word fresco, almost without fail, the first thing that our general public are going to think about are the monumental frescoes of the Renaissance, and they are monuments to art history. We have 2 fantastic examples here, the Arena Chapel or the Scribini Chapel in Padua, I always want to say Padua, Italy, by Giotto, and then the Last Supper, the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo in the Vatican at Rome. Both fantastic, gigantic projects. And particularly in the Arena Chapel in Giotto's work, we see one of the problems with fresco. You might notice in these details that the blue sky looks a bit rough. That's because that pigment in particular is the very expensive ultramarine blue. And in the time of Giotto, ultramarine blue was considered a pigment that you should not put into the fresco itself because it would probably deteriorate after you'd spent so much money on it. So it was frequently applied a secco, that is, painted onto the drywall after the fresco had dried. The blue was applied in a different medium. And you see the problem here. It hasn't stuck to the wall very well. It's deteriorated quite a bit while the rest of the fresco has stood up very well. In the case of the Michelangelo, we're looking at a detail in the lower center of the giornata. The giornata had been marked out in white borders. And this figure is much larger than normal size, I believe 12, 14 feet tall probably. And if we do a very quick count, we might see 9 or 10 giornata there. But in particular, look at the orangey garment in the lower part is quite large. That giornata is quite large. That's 1 day's worth of work. While you'll see the head giornata is quite small. Why is that? The larger giornata of the drapery is quick to paint. There's only 2 or 3 different colors there. It's a fairly quick thing to make. The face, on the other hand, is always a difficult thing to do. And so Michelangelo has reserved a whole day just to do this head. Next slide. When we move to the United States, the first person to talk about is Nicola Montechesi. He was an adult artist who immigrated from Italy after having been trained at the Academy St. Luke in Rome. And he brought his fresco technique to the United States, and he worked quite extensively in the Philadelphia area, including St. Augustine's Church. He's not particularly well known. And the next artist, Constantino Brumidi, is not very well known either, surprisingly, because he worked in the United States Capitol for over 20 years and did literally miles of fresco throughout that building and other buildings in the area. Next slide. So here's my introduction. This is the Constantino Brumidi fresco in the dome of the Capitol building. And it is truly monumental. We see only a small section of it here on the right. This mural is on a curved surface on the inside of the dome, and it covers over 5,000 square feet. It's been restored once or twice, but because it's so hard to get to, not very frequently. So I was very fortunate in the 1980s, one of my first conservation projects, to be on a team that cleaned and repaired this fresco. And you see a detail of us working on the right. And you can just see me, a little dark figure right in the lower center, kind of half covered up by the fresco. I want to point out, in this image, you really get a scale for the size of this work. And I want to point out that that figure on the wall, I can't believe it's Liberty, I believe, it looks like it's being spotlighted, but in fact, that's because it's cleaned. The borders that you see to the side are where the cleaning has stopped at that point. So you can see just how dirty that painting was. But this was my introduction into fresco and understanding the qualities of it. Next slide. Mexican muralism of the 1920s. After the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century, there was a lot of energy put into putting forward social and political messages, and murals were seen as a way to do this. And I'm sure murals were made in many different medium, but this was really a true revival of the technique of fresco by Diego Rivera and other Mexican muralists. Diego Rivera was a fantastic painter. I invite you at some point in your life, please go to the Detroit Institute of Art and see this fantastic room that he created. You'll just love these paintings. In the detail to the far right, you get a hint at the kind of social comment that was frequently made in these kind of works. We see a group of people in gas masks and whatnot creating bombs. Next slide, please. The experience of the Mexican muralists and their work in the United States in particular helped to plant the seed for many of the paintings that came after that, especially during the Great Depression. Several of the federal programs that were put forward to put people back to work, including putting artists back to work and making public murals. These murals oftentimes have the same kind of social and political messages wrapped into them that we saw in the Mexican muralism, and once again, in very public buildings. A great example of this is Coy Tower in San Francisco. There are over 25 artists represented in the work here. We see one example of that at lower left. Once again, the architectural space itself says so much about how the painting is made and what it shows us. We have this trompe-l'oeil newsstand in the very front of the image, where in fact a real door opens up to usher you into the gift shop at Coy Tower. In the image itself, we have some of the social realism it's famous for. The gentleman in the front there is being robbed at gunpoint, while in the far distance, which I'm sure is hard to see, we have a car accident where people are rushing to help the people that have been hurt in the car accident. But not all of the murals had such obvious social commentary. Some of them were just for art's sake. And we have a great example of that with Louise Braun, who painted a very large fresco in the Mount Vernon Public Library in New York. And these had a literary theme, something along the lines of the Canterbury Tales or something like that, but beautiful murals. Next slide, please. And now we come to North Carolina and of course, Ben Long. And at this point, I'd like to turn the podium over to Christopher Holt.
Okay, so let's talk about my relationship to Ben for a second and kind of the lineage of fresco and how that worked. I was able to study fresco with Ben as he began the Morganton ceiling fresco, which was done, I think, in 2005, and really just get thrown into the process. I had seen Diego's work in Mexico, and my relationship with Ben began in Asheville when I went up to his studio one day. Somebody suggested I go meet him, and he walked up, and he said that they were about to go to the first day of his opening of his drawing and painting school in Asheville. And so it just took off from there, and the world of fresco just kind of came flying at me with Ben. And that I was really lucky in that way. And in terms of being an artist, Ben's work in fresco really just bared down in and leans on your drawing preparation, and in your work, everything that you do leading up to the point when you are painting the fresco itself. And I think that that's just an important thing to know and recognize as when you look at art, and for artists themselves, and knowing about the process and all the work done before the final image begins. And so the show here at the museum kind of dictates that. And as Perry said, you're hopefully someday soon you'll be welcome to come to Asheville to visit the real thing. So the images you see, the St. Mary's Church in West Jefferson was one of Ben's first frescoes in around 1980 that he painted after studying in Italy with Pietro Annigoni. One of the last great kind of Italian true fresco painters was his teacher and friend. And then there on the right, the Bank of America is just kind of Ben's kind of astonishing masterwork in triptych in the Bank of America. And then up there you see Ben, who right there, he's probably in his 50s. So it looks like he's working on the Bank of America there. But Ben was around Asheville when I was painting last year, and I had the opportunity to have him kind of swing through the fresco and give us little bits of encouragement and advice. And I think at some points even kind of probably get a good laugh about how much we were struggling through the process with him on the sidelines. And knowing him, he probably took a little joy and pleasure in seeing our pain. But that's Ben Long. I feel honored to be a student and to be able to carry on this tradition that I was able to learn from him. Let's go ahead and pass on to the next slide. So the Haywood Street story, I'm kind of going to give a rundown of how it started. I would go to the Haywood Street and just draw on Wednesdays when they had their downtown welcome table. They feed between 500 and 1,000 people a week, and there are all kinds of characters there. And as over time, this was when I was working with Ben, and then over time, I was introduced to the pastor there by my friend Rob Blackburn, and the pastor there is Brian Combs, and he kind of just kind of organically, the idea kind of came about that we would maybe paint a fresco at Haywood Street one day. And so as that came along, I started drawing, I started working on ideas. So what you see in the very bottom, the kind of brown ink drawing, that was my composition that I began working from in order to move towards the fresco. And the composition alone, I spent a year kind of working it out and sharing it with Brian, and kind of coming to like the working composition you see below before I started drawing models for the project. And as I started drawing models, I was joined by my team, my friends and colleagues. As you can see, your first image there is John Dempsey, our main colorist and fresco expert. He's there drawing in Lucignano, Italy. And I said this when Perry and I talked about this project before, that I think John is probably the most experienced fresco colorist on the planet. He worked for Ben Long for his frescoes. He worked with Ben Long's colleague, Roger Nelson, on his frescoes. And then, of course, our project this past year. And as far as like unique skill and expertise, I think he's the man. Then you see Miss Mary there, the next photograph. She became the model for the fresco centerpiece, which I'll kind of refer to her a little bit later, but she is one of the leaders of the Downtown Welcome Table and kind of organizer and main chef, along with Dave Holland, at Haywood Street. So you see, what you see is her picture, and you see her her drawing in the cartoon behind her. And then there's one of the rare photos where all four of our team was together. Well, there were five of us, so that Anselm is not in that picture, but you see Jill Hooper on your bottom right of your screen with her drawing, and then on the left of the group photo, then there's me and John Dempsey, and then Caleb Clark, who you also see applying the plaster in the fourth photo. And Caleb Clark is an artist and painter and etcher here in Asheville, also a student of Ben's, who really he and Anselm Long took on the plaster process each day, and this was their first project working on. So we all had a lot of coming together to work as a team, and also to take on the challenges that Fresco presents, as you kind of got an idea of when you saw Perry or listened to Perry. And then you see me kind of covered in plaster. As we began drawing the models, we also had to prep the wall and put down those first layers of arricchio on the metal lath, and that is what really messy and kind of tough process that we did back in November of 2019 is when we started that part. And then the bottom left of the photo is me working on the Sinopia, which you heard Perry refer to. That's the layer where you paint in with a red earth color over top of your underlayer of plaster, and that ultimately gets covered up by the fresco itself. But that's the same layer that you see behind us in the third photo where we're there, that kind of red earth painting. You go through all of your tracings and put them up on the wall to be painted, and then paint the whole composition in that color, so as you can step back and really see your composition for the first time. It's the last chance you have to make alterations in your tracings, or to move things left or right, or enlarge something. And we had a couple things to work out once we saw that. We had a morning where everybody came with their various coffees, and we really went at it for about 3 hours, picking it apart to what needed to be tweaked finally before we could begin the first painting day. And then the gentleman in the hat, you see the second photo on the bottom left of your screen. That's Robert. That's his portrait drawing from life. Robert is kind of he's a mainstay at the Haywood Street congregation. He does all the gardening and the flowers outside, and is a real kind of ambassador to everyone that comes through. And we'll see him in the final image of the fresco here shortly. All right, so I mentioned Jill and Caleb, and then Anselm Long, who's not pictured. We'll see him in a moment. And Anselm worked a lot with Caleb in the plaster and was part of our team. And he is also Ben Long's fourth son. And Anselm, I worked with him when he was in high school in Asheville, and he started off as our helper, and then really earned his spot as an apprentice, and then on the team. And this was his first fresco, so it's cool to have him on the project as kind of complete the circle with Ben Long. So, and then hopefully into the future. So let's move to the next slide. Here's a group of photos of us working on the project. There's on the left, the top left, is Jill Hooper and I. Jill is an amazing artist and painter based out of Charleston, South Carolina. And having her on the team was just really just kind of sealed the deal for pushing us to make it better, and also helping us work out all of our issues along the way. What you see us doing is we have the tracing placed over the work from the previous day and into the area to be painted right below it. And where it looks like we're lining up the staff of that torch to go into where it was into the day's painting. And where you see right above my head and next to Jill, that kind of yellow ochreish area, that's the area of intonaco that would be painted on this day's painting. And you have Jill in the next picture, the second picture, toning that. When you actually lay it on, it's kind of white, as you see around the edge, and you tone it each day so as you're not painting onto a white surface, just as you would an oil painting, or that some people practice with oil painting. The bottom left picture of me, that's in the red pants, is me kind of drawing in the tracing and kind of connecting the dots. Because as you saw that kind of wheel tool Perry showed in his part of the lecture, we just actually used a needle, but you just make the holes and then you pounce them, and then you have to connect. Basically, the first step of painting in fresco is connecting the dots. So I have that to kind of live up to. And then there's me working in the bottom center, just it looks like just drawing in some folks that are underneath the welcome table. And then kind of a in process shot where you see just Mary's head with a lot of the Sinopia showing underneath. And that was just a good shot to see kind of what it looks like along the way, because it really puzzle pieces itself together as you create the painting. And then the top image of the crew there, that is a photo of all of the models that could be gathered on the day we had the blessing of the fresco at Haywood Street. And there everyone is kind of like checking themselves out and probably, you know, finding some way to give me a hard time. All right, let's move on to the next image. Okay, this is a good example. This is a part of the museum show. The image you see of the young boy Damon, who's in the fresco, this is a test panel that is about, let's say, 16 by 24 inches that you can kind of tote around. But this is what we used in the studio as we were preparing our colors and kind of getting our game plan together before we moved all of our operation from my studio to Haywood Street. And so I did just a kind of a practice portrait that took a day just to work on the painting. And then as we tested the colors, and what you can see in the diagram, you see the wood panel support. In the church, we actually had a metal support, but this one's lighter and easier to tote around with the wire lath, which is how we did it at Haywood Street, because the back wall of the church, it was brick on one side and then had some drywall and framing on the other. So I didn't want to put the arricchio and the underlayers on two different surfaces. So we used a metal frame from there and put our plaster, first layer plaster, through that metal lath, which was bolted onto the wall. So it was kind of a metal frame that becomes part of the wall. It just makes it more uniform throughout. And this was a technique that I'd learned from working with Ben Long and Roger Nelson on some of their projects that are in modern buildings, even though the church itself is over 100 years old. And then the arricchio, the first layer plaster, we were able to use horsehair from various places around Buncombe County, including some horsehair from Hickory Nut Gap Farm out in Fairview. And then finally the intonaco and the paint layer, which, as Perry said, they kind of go together, as the intonaco, the lime and sand in that layer are the binder that pulls the pigment ground in water into the surface and holds it there. You know, like you said, it doesn't sit on the surface. It actually is pulled in to become part of the wall forever. And that kind of skin of held time is what really holds the light and makes fresco unique, and it's powerful, it gives it its powerful staying power. Okay, let's move along to the next slide. Okay, so here is the final fresco that you're seeing, on your computer screen. That is 9.5 by 27 feet. So I'm going to just kind of talk through some of the imagery, and if there's something that speaks to you or you want to ask a question about, just put it in the Q&A and we'll get to it after once we get to that point in the story. So when we said cartoon, what that was there is a drawing that is part of the museum show that is the 9.5 by 27 foot composition of the fresco on paper and drawn in charcoal. And that's what we use to trace and then bring this story that you see forward on your screen. And that part is after the drawing of models comes the drawing of the cartoon, which we did last spring here in my studio before moving to the church and getting started, which we started around July 1st of last year. When we started you have to start at the top, because one, you can't do something on the bottom and then plaster above it and risk scraping and plaster coming down and ruining what you've painted. And also because as you're painting, you can spray just distilled water over top of the fresco. It'll just pull in the water. It won't make the colors run, and it keeps it wet and fresh. Fresco means fresh and kind of is part of the process in that way. So we started with the rainbow, and we actually did that in one day. We set up all our scaffolding all across the top, and we in kind of like homage to the Haywood Street's idea of community and reaching out, we literally passed a brush from one scaffold to the other, from one artist to the other, to kind of help paint this rainbow and keep it uniform because instead of climbing through the scaffolding and such. And the rainbows just became part of the composition because Haywood Street, it is a little bit kind of under the rainbow. It is that pot of gold for a lot of people, that it's the place where you're on the street and you come to the downtown welcome table and somebody might remember your name. You can get that meal that's prepared by one of Asheville's restaurants. And it is kind of a paradise. And so I really wanted to basically blatantly say that about Haywood Street and include that idea in this kind of Haywood Street is somewhere under the rainbow in the image itself. And then you have the hands of giving or receiving. That really kind of is their mantra of who is really helping who in this community. And then we move to the statues. The statues are meant to be like sculptures or guardians and kind of these light bearers shining out into the darkness. And the one on the right, is her name is Jeanette, and Jeanette is a super volunteer and member of the Haywood Street community who just has a powerful presence from the respite, where they have 8 beds of folks who come off the street and can stay there and heal if they are released from the hospital and have nowhere to go, and have 3 meals a day and rides to their doctor and care. To Charlie Burns over on the left, who was really my introduction to Haywood Street, and someone who really became a friend, who really gave a lot of credence to this project to folks along the way. And so Charlie was the first guy that I drew for the project, and he was living with cancer and had been for a decade when I drew him. And we lost Charlie just as the project was getting ready to start last year. And I wanted to render him as kind of an unfinished sculpture. That's why you see him kind of coming out of a stone, because he was a guy who just never really stopped planning his next adventure, or was always on to some way of helping the next person. Just as this idea that we are all kind of, no matter what's going on, we're kind of unfinished works of art ourselves, who continue to kind of make our story and kind of move forward and, you know, touch the lives of others as the best we can. And Charlie just embraced not only that idea, he lended it to Haywood Street forever. And so anyway, these two monuments on either side came next. And then we moved over to the Angel, and Angel is a person in the Haywood Street community who had lost her job because she had some heart trouble, and she would come to the meals and really have no place to go. And she kind of inspired the idea of for the respite. And I kind of wanted to have an angel in the composition so that when you walked in, you knew that something ethereal and something magical was going on. Just to portray that feeling as you came in. And Angel, you know, she kind of was a perfect person for that role. And, you know, some angels can be a little off-putting and a bit scary, but our Angel is very much herself. And then over on the right side, I kind of have an idealized skyline of Asheville, with the highest building was the old Stevens Lee High School, which was built in 1923, and it was the only high school for Black students in Western North Carolina. And it was kind of a high point for arts and culture and of academic education. It was just an amazing school, and it was torn down kind of, you know, off the radar in 1975 without any story. And this was just kind of a way to put it back on Nashville skyline and remind people of that place and kind of give it its moment, or not give it its moment, give it its lifetime back in the public eye here through the fresco. I'm just kind of like given a ability to kind of jump around. The back mountain view is a view from Max Patch, and there's a crossroads sign on the little road there that was kind of an homage to Ben Long's fresco, the Crossroads fresco in Statesville. And on there we put, it's the crossroads of Holy Chaos and Fresco Truth, which Holy Chaos is the description of the environment at Haywood Street, because it is very much lives up to that tale. And then but below Angel is the welcome table itself. And this part was part of the fresco that I really struggled with when I was forming the composition, and kind of ended up in this way that it's really the volunteers and the people that come that really make the table. Like the table doesn't exist without all of the folks that work around it. And so it's kind of like this, you know, Ganesh-like style image of just all these helping hands that kind of set the table for Haywood Street to kind of come to life. And then over across the way from, well, we'll go through. So the guy in the orange shirt, that's Dave Holland. He's the head of the downtown welcome table and the orchestrator of its meals, and along with Mary there in the middle. And their partnership has given the power to this table that they set and orchestrate the restaurants through their work. And Mary, I wasn't quite sure who was going to be the center of the fresco, but Mary spent her life looking out for people. And at her home, if somebody in her community needed a meal, they could come to her house, and that she would, if the chairs were filled, she would set them up a little place on the floor. If somebody's power got turned off down the way from her, there would be an extension cord going out her window. She just, her life was about taking care of people through food and love. And she found her way to Haywood Street, much like Dave Holland did as well. He was on the street and kind of finding his voice, and this Haywood Street itself opened up for them to be the place to do their life's work. And so I really thought it was important to have them anchor the center of the picture. And then on the side, to the right is the kind of campfire scene where, we have to remember how many folks are, this whole shelter in place idea is all well and good for those who have shelter. But there are many of our friends who are out on the street, and this is their life together. And I wanted this kind of moment to come together, not in utter despair, but in community and in reality, that despite where you are in life, there is a togetherness, there is a looking out for each other, and there is hope. But there is also the reality that the lives are spent outside. And so this is kind of a gathering of various individuals that make up the community of Haywood Street, from Michael and Popeye, Blue and Eric, Thomas, and then the gentleman in the purple with cane, James. James is kind of our, I don't know, I kind of like think of him as like just kind of the wise person. He's kind of contemplating life and aware of its kind of vital potential, no matter where you are in your experience. And then next to James, right behind James, is Brian Combs, kind of coming out from behind the wall as the pastor who kind of fought tooth and nail not to be in the fresco. But I just thought forward, 100 years, and I thought it was important that Brian be there, because it was really his work and his dedication to the neediest of folks and to his calling that created Haywood Street. And so I thought I had to make sure he was there. So in front of him, you have kind of the man in meditation or prayer. His name is Michael, and Michael oversees the respite at Haywood Street. And in his person, that really is his pose. That's kind of how he is in real life. And that's where kind of in this picture, reality does kind of strike a chord with who these folks that you see really are. And his presence in any room is felt with this kind of Zen-like quality of compassion. And he's one of the kind of biggest figures that stand out there in the foreground. And below him is kind of a sleeping Buddha character, another kind of just place to think about where folks sleep and how you get along when you have no place to call home, except for a place like Haywood Street, perhaps. And then the two individuals above him, Jerry and Wayne. These two guys really represent Haywood Street and what it is. Wayne has had his struggles with substance abuse and recovery, and is really a mainstay at Haywood Street now that he looks out for people. He's part of what they call the Mercy League, and he helps a lot of people. And in this in this image, he's being looked after by Jerry, and Jerry is another great Haywood Street friend who has had his own struggles, but they have something in Haywood Street where they have folks go on hikes on the Appalachian Trail. And I think it was Brian's dad actually who told me that Jerry was always the last person, making sure everybody was coming in, nobody was getting left behind, and everyone was okay. And so there he is as kind of protector and caretaker. And Jerry was also best friends with Charlie. And so I love looking at both of them on either side of the fresco, kind of in there, holding it up as pillars in a way. And then all the way across, you have Edward playing the piano. And Edward was just kind of, he's a virtuoso organ player. He is the organ player at Haywood Street. He really brings a lot of energy and passion. And he had his struggles and times on the street, and Haywood Street kind of became his home. And I wanted to include him playing the piano just because I feel like in this picture, even when you walk in and it's silent, you kind of want to feel like there's music in the air. and that movement blowing off with the musical, the sheet music blowing off into the clouds and into the great Smoky Mountain mist there, kind of coming from behind the crowd, was an important kind of part of just the feeling of energy and movement that goes along with just kind of the characters and color and composition. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Go on and on in a way, but it's better to kind of work off the questions. And I think what we'll do is we'll do that from there as we kind of moves towards the last part of the lecture. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. The end. Okay, so if we want to leave the last one up, if that helps with questions, or however, we like to have Perry join back in just in case we got a question to answer together. Or
so we do have a question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
One for you, Chris. What is it about fresco? And this comes from Liza Roberts. What is it about fresco that compels you as an artist as opposed to traditional painting? Is it the permanence? Is it the connection to place?
That's a great question. Working on Ben's projects, I got to work on the project at the Crossnor School in the mountains of North Carolina. And I really saw how deeply it could connect a community. And that's really what did it for me. I mean, for me, it was working with other artists and a team, and also just in a place where it could inspire so much because you are creating it in real time. I mean, we were there from July 1st until almost October 1st in place, not to mention that I drew everyone from life. And so it has a living quality that is unlike anything else. I really think that's what it was for me. And Haywood Street, it is that already. And so it's like this medium was made for a place like Haywood Street. And you could see why it in Italy during the Renaissance, why it became kind of the main mediums, because of the way it could capture and tell a story and remain that way. And then technically, I would, when not painting fresco, I really prefer watercolor, and it's kind of like the natural, the grandparent of all watercolors. So I hope that helps it. And the challenge itself on every level is part of it too. It really invigorates.
So we also have specific questions about the mural itself.
Okay.
Ellen Blair asks, what are Charlie and Jeanette holding besides their flames? And who is holding flowers on the left? Okay,
so they are holding the communion elements. Charlie has his little flask of wine, and Jeanette is holding a bundle of wheat. At Haywood Street, they do the communion every day, every Wednesday, Sunday when they do their service. And so that was kind of just a part of their story. And then Robert holding the flowers, he is, I'd say, the most vocal Haywood Street ambassador. He's there to welcome every stranger who comes in, and he caretakes the garden in front of in front of the church building. And whispering in his ear is one of his pals. Her name is Soleil, and I drew her. Her mother Brooke is a huge part of the Haywood Street community and does all of their storytelling. And Soleil and Robert are big buddies. And someone has asked her what she was whispering in Robert's ear. She said, "You're amazing," which was, she's so cute.
And Marianne Debsky wants to know if the dog is Charlie's.
Yes, the dog is Emma the Wonder Dog. It was Charlie's dog. Emma was the first kind of community dog there. It was Charlie's dog and was just always on the scene there. And, you know, lots of folks have dogs. These are their companions on the street. They, as for all of us who love them and have them, but Emma was everybody loved Emma the Wonder Dog. And when Charlie passed away, Charlie's family in Memphis took Emma, and I saw a picture of her recently. She's doing great. That's Emma the Wonder Dog, Charlie's dog.
And we have another question about the mural itself from Ellen K. Why are the two figures behind Michael colorless?
Oh, they are just silhouetted in front of the flame of the fire. That is kind of hard to see in just how small the image is, but yeah, they're just, the fire is so bright. They're sitting on this side of it, so you just see their silhouette as you would when you walk up on somebody sitting at a campfire.
And Joan Evans, I guess this could be a question for both of you. Okay. She's asking, given that the pigment permeates the outer layer of plaster, does that lend an extra depth to the painting?
I think so. As Fresco over time, over at least a year, the colors continue to change a little bit slowly and get brighter and just more fully themselves. And, you know, the ones that have lime in it become a little lighter as they're affected by the lime. And as Perry was saying, they really are, you know, one of the real elements to the work is the architecture that has held it. So it's part of the recipe of the building. But I would definitely say that, you know, the way that it dries and the way the pigment is held within the plaster definitely adds a depth of field and just a kind of saturation of color feeling when you're in its presence.
The one thing I might add to that is that I think the way I would describe Fresco is the luminosity of it.
Yeah.
Chris referred to it as being the granddaddy of watercolor, and watercolor has that same quality. The support itself, the paper in a watercolor, the fresco, the plaster in a fresco, it's always visible. It's always showing through, at least in kind of a reflection off of that surface. And so it really lends a luminosity that you don't get in a dense oil paint or a dense acrylic, something like that.
We have another question. This one's from John Giardina. Are the white areas pure plaster showing through in the mural?
No, they're not pure plaster showing through. They're actually, because you do, like in the one image where I was working with Jill, you do tone the white plaster. So when you begin, you're at a mid-tone, which is just always helpful in painting, so that you're not seeing the brightest bright as you're painting. You're able to judge tones of other colors as you move along. So that is the plaster that you use to mix with the sand to paint the fresco. Just the plaster itself, ground like all the other colors, and then painted back on to the fresco. And that color, that white, is so white that if it just touches the fresco, I mean, it comes up as bright as it can be. So the pages you see coming off, the tablecloth coming off the table, that is the pure white of the plaster, repainted onto the Insonico.
We have actually two questions from Ellen Blair. One is for you, Chris. How was this amazing project funded?
Okay, we basically, the long story. No, not like, we received a grant that we had to turn down because technically it was it was from the TDA here in Asheville, and that money comes from the hotel tax to invest in the community for, you know, tourist reasons. So people come to Asheville, and technically we weren't allowed, we couldn't take it because Haywood Street is a church. So we decided to turn that down. And what we did was we had a committee of about 14 people who worked for 2 years to make this project happen. And this was a team led by our fearless leader, Pam Siekman, who is just a jewel of Asheville. And she orchestrated us. And what we did was we did house parties where I would come and speak about the project. I would show the preliminary composition and drawings. And then I would speak. Sometimes Brian Combs would speak, and sometimes Liz Button would speak. And Liz Button is the CEO of Curate, and their restaurants. Katie Button is her daughter, and she is one of the main people behind the downtown welcome table and how they created, how they help got all the different restaurants to participate in that downtown welcome table. So Liz would speak about the welcome table, I about the fresco. So we really raised the money through kind of the Asheville arts community. We didn't want to raise the money from the folks that are already making Haywood Street happen in the way that they do. And so we were able to kind of, we would friend and fundraise all around the county. And most of it was Buncombe County. I'd say 90% of it. But it was this was a labor of love. I mean, our committee, and then my family and our team. I mean, it was we really worked for it because we believed in it, and we believed in what Haywood Street is doing for Asheville and in its way for America, for the world.
Thank you, Chris. So Ellen also has a question for Perry. What conservation efforts would you employ to maintain this masterpiece?
Good question. I think knowing Chris, and I've talked to him about the process and whatnot, I'm pretty confident that he's made a true fresco the way it's been made for millennia. And if it's made well, it takes care of itself in so many ways. It will live as long as the building lives. Just like every building that we live in, we worry about the roof and is water leaking in and I guess fires and all sorts of things. But fresco is incredibly robust. So there's really not a whole lot of upkeep that it needs. Having worked on a lot of public frescoes, murals in general, I see the casual damage that happens to them because they are in a public sphere, say on a hallway or a place where people pass through. Things happen. Carts run into it, people fall into it, people cleaning up the floor accidentally hit it with their broom handles, things like that. I mean, little insults happen over time. It's just a fact with all artwork. But the fresco is incredibly robust, and it will stand the test of time. As you saw on the mural in the U.S. Capitol building, they get dirty. Everything gets dirty. That's just the way it is. And eventually, someone could decide to clean it, and there are safe ways to clean and less safe ways to clean. There are not a lot of people around working on frescoes, so you definitely, just like any artwork, you want to get somebody who's aware of the complexity of it and has the experience to work on something specific like that. But there's relatively little to do other than to protect it from the casual damage. It will hold up very well. The pigments in general that are used in fresco generally don't fade very much. You can't say that about watercolors and a lot of oil paintings and even modern day acrylics, things like that. We still have colors that can fade rather dramatically. But the environment for the fresco is demanding in and of itself, and most of the pigments that you use are very stable and won't fade all that much. So once again, I think the fresco in a lot of ways, it will take care of itself if it's made well.
All right, thank you, Perry. We have another question from Ellen K. She wants to know, why use horsehair in preparation? Is it cheaper than other materials?
Well, horses have been around a long time. I guess there's some kind of symbiotic relationship there that they don't mind donating their tails or something. I don't know, to Fresco. When you're trying to make a structure stronger like concrete, you put something long and strong into it. If you're in modern day construction, if you're making a wall or a floor out of concrete, you're putting a metal lathe into it, a long rebar of metal bar to help cross the structure and laterally make it much stronger. Horsehair does that on a smaller scale. You mix that in there, it becomes incorporated in, and it stretches along and creates fibers that cross and make a structure stronger.
Great. And then I believe this might be our last couple of questions. How much time, this is from an anonymous attendee, how much time did it take to decide on what to include, all of the vignettes, and whom to include? Was it a group process to decide? Was it a big challenge to fit it all together in one image?
So I really spent a year on the composition, and there were, you know, eight or nine of them. And Brian Combs has an arts background. He was a design student at NC State before he went on to divinity school, and he got it from the beginning. I would say that was one of the reasons we were able to do a fresco, is like he knew how it could continue to speak for years to come, and he I don't know, he believed in me, I think, too. And so when I would go to him and say, you know, what do you think about this or that, he would chime in, but I really had the artistic license to tell the story. The tough part for me wasn't, as I worked out the composition, wasn't who to leave out in the composition. I kind of felt good as how it came together, but was when it came time to draw the models, I knew that we could only draw so many, there could only be so many people in the picture. And for a place where no one's left out or left behind, the reality that not everybody could be in it was the hardest part. But I think even in the characters that I did represent, those folks do represent the ones that aren't physically the models that we chose. That makes sense. But yeah, it was a long, I really, knowing that, you know, when you're going to paint something in fresco, people ask me, you know, it is built to last. You know, my friends who, we haven't seen it yet, I'm like, it's going to be there. Knowing that, I will spend an extra amount of time on the composition itself, even though it was only this big or this big, you know, because when you invest your full I mean, the whole time scale for the project from, oh, this is a good idea, to now when we finished was about 8 years, 2 years of like meetings weekly with our team, you know, 5 months of painting, etc. So extra time on the drawing stages.
I have a question, or actually, no, we just got a question from Laura Ballard. What are you working on now? What is next for Christopher Holt?
Well, I have my studios here at my house. So I did a couple large landscape paintings since the quarantine started. I was still able to go out painting. I lived here in Weaverville, North Carolina, right outside of Asheville. And, you know, I was planning to be really kind of looking for the next big fresco project. So if anyone has any ideas or connections, reach out and let me know. But at this time, I'm just doing studio work. I work with a couple galleries, and that's where I am now. In a strange way, I think for artists, this time is, you know, we're used to kind of, you know, not having an exact schedule and continuing our work despite not knowing where the next thing is. So I feel like I've been lucky enough to just keep working, and you know, like everyone during COVID-19, things are different. And there are some days of just kind of astonishment and mourning and search for inspiration. But I think that's one of the keys of my art, or my being an artist, is working from life. And I think always the return to nature is healthy.
Great, thank you. My question was what were their reactions when they saw the fresco, when they saw themselves?
I mean, this kind of goes back to that previous question. I mean, along the way, I mean, these are my friends. I mean, some people I drew one-on-one, or with Caleb and Anselm and John or Jill, whoever was joining me for the portrait session. We drew for 8 or 10 hours, just one person's face in charcoal or pencil. These are the work that's at the museum. So we knew each other. And so I'd say there's a great sense of pride. There's, it's kind of, when you know that you're going to be represented forever, there's that really kind of puts you in somewhat of a philosophic tone. But really there's just an overall feeling of success that we did it together in this way. And then we capped it off with 15 of them came to the museum on March 6th. So this is right before we all shut down. These folks were able to come to Haywood Street and see themselves in a museum. And so, you know, this is the power. This is why we love art. This is why there are museums and why there are all of us brought together today. I mean, this is our story of lifting each other up through adversity, and our story to be told way beyond our time on this earth.
Great. And Perry, I have a question for you as well. What are you working on? What are your big projects?
Good question. Lots of things, right? In the immediate future, it'll be about reopening the museum.
Yes.
It'll be all hands on deck to get the collection whipped into shape to allow the public back in and see what we've been up to. The museum has not closed down. That's the official line. Of course, we couldn't welcome the public, but we never stopped working. We've done all sorts of virtual content before today that you can see much of it on the website. But and that's taken quite a bit of my time. But getting back in, I'll be doing a lot of art handling in the near future, swapping out images, artworks on the various things, getting a couple more exhibitions open, checking on the exhibitions we do have. We've extended all of the existing exhibitions. I believe Chris's exhibition was due to close in July, and now it's been extended, I believe, up until January at least. So there'll be plenty of time for people to come and see his work. Beyond that, of course, we've got a long list of things to treat with conservation. I'm still working on my early British portraits, things like that. But in the short term, it's all about trying to get back in there and make the artwork come alive again in the museum for our public.
That's right.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Perry, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Thank you all for joining this virtual lecture. We hope you enjoyed this new experience and hope you join us for our new upcoming virtual programs.